Welcome to my Wetland Plant Identification class. My name is Abe Lloyd, I'm your instructor. And let's see, this is the first unit and we'll be exploring forested wetlands and shrub wetlands, essentially wetlands that have woody plants in them. And for this unit I will visit actually two sites. The first is a swamp that is kind of near Sumas Mountain, just on the side of the road. And even though the side of the road doesn't sound very glamorous, this actually is one of the best swamps that I've seen in Whatcom County. So we'll explore a lot of the woody plants in this swamp. And then we're going to go to Tennant Lake. And Tennant Lake has a number of different types of wetlands, but we'll be focusing on the shrub community along the boardwalk at Tennant Lake. And then, for one of our other units, we're going to be looking at fresh marshes, and we'll go back to Tennant Lake to look at the marsh community. All right, so I'm actually right here on South Pass Road with the swamp behind me. And just briefly, I covered this in the lecture, but good indicators of swamps are skunk cabbage and lady fern in the understory. We see both of those. And often cedar and spruce in the overstory, especially in mature swamps, and we see that as well. Now, many swamps aren't this mature because they've been cut over or they're just in more disturbed areas, and it's also common to see in swamps a lot of alder, especially in old field swamps. And in riparian swamps you might see some cottonwood and more cedar. So I brought my boots because it's been rainy recently, and that'll help us get in and look at plants. But I'm just going to be covering a lot of the woody plants in this first unit because I think it's a good intro to the plant world. Woody plants are often, their distinguishing characteristics are a little bit bigger, unlike the herbaceous plants, and especially the graminoids, the grasses and sedges, which you really have to get close to sometimes to see their key features. All right, so the soil here is definitely saturated like a wetland should be. I like to bring a bucket with me when I'm carrying around my plant books because if I have a bag and I want to set the bag on the ground, it'll get wet, but I can set the bucket in the water and everything stays dry. For reasons I don't quite understand, a lot of the swamp vegetation is really aromatic and smells strongly. And right now, I mean, just being here without even disturbing the plants, I could smell the skunk cabbage. And there's also, so here's the skunk cabbage. I think this will be a pretty easy plant for most people, one that you probably know already. So this is Lysichiton americanus. Big, broad leaves. They look a little bit like banana leaves, and it has yellow flowers in the spring. They're pretty much done flowering now. And this plant will, the flowers will actually emerge when the leaves are still quite young, but the leaves are just about full size. And it's an important plant to many Native Americans in this region because the leaves are kind of used like wax paper to set things on or to put over the top of an earthen pit oven. So the food goes underground and the leaves go on top, and then you pile dirt over the top, and the leaves keep the dirt from falling on the food. And it's also a really important plant to a number of wildlife, like bears in the early spring. They will come out of hibernation, and they're pretty constipated, and their gut isn't really working, and they'll eat some skunk cabbage shoots, just the young leaves and shoots, and that'll stimulate their digestive system. Okay, we're near a road, so a lot of vehicles are going by, but I'll try and cut that out if possible. Another kind of stinky plant, resinous smelling plant, is right here. And this leaf to many looks like thimbleberry or a little bit like a maple leaf. But if you rub the leaf and smell your fingers or break the leaf and smell the crushed leaf, it has an odor that actually is fairly similar to the skunk cabbage odor. although I find it pleasing. I think it smells a little bit like lemon or citrus. And this is called, commonly called stink currant or Ribes bracteosum. So Ribes is the genus of all the currants and gooseberries, and generally we use the common name gooseberry for the ones that have spines on the stem, and currant for the ones that don't have any spines on the stem. So if we look at this stem, we can see that it doesn't have any spines, and so it fits that pattern. That's called stink currant because it doesn't have spines and it smells kind of stinky, or fragrant at least. I like it. So one feature, besides it not having thorns or prickles, is the base of the leaves have these little hairs. This is called a petiole, and where the petiole attaches to the twig, you sometimes have what's called a stipule, which is a leaf-shaped structure, but these are further devolved or diminutive into just these hair-like things. And so those, a couple other currants have that, but the combination of the resinous smelling leaves, the thornless stalk, and these hairs are good features for this time of the year. And it has a really long cluster of flowers and fruits that can be 6 inches long or so. So that's the stink currant, very common in saturated soils. It will occasionally grow in upland soils as well. Actually don't know off the top of my head, but my guess is that it's a facultative wet plant. It might be just facultative. All right, the mud is wet. So another plant here right beside me, very common in wet soils, sometimes in areas with a little more light than this, but it can tolerate some dark understory conditions and darkness as well. This is the salmonberry, Rubus spectabilis. And the salmonberry has, instead of one leaf like the currant, it has 3 leaflets. All right? So this is what's called a compound leaf. That's actually kind of a bad example because it looks like there's more, but how about here? So this whole thing is a leaf, and each of these, this whole thing is a leaf, and each of these is called a leaflet. And so this is the petiole, and if you have a stalk on a leaflet, it's called the petiolet. So a petiole for a leaf and a petiolet for a leaflet. Salmonberry is starting to ripen at this time of the year. So here's one that isn't ripe yet, but it's no longer flowering at least. And you know, if we look around, we might find here, this one over here is even closer to ripe. When they're fully ripe, they're either a golden yellow or kind of a red-orange salmon colored. And salmonberry stems are sometimes smooth without any prickles, and sometimes they have prickles. Right here we can see those fine prickles. All right, we have a number of ferns in western Washington, but lady fern is the one that can tolerate its toes getting wet the most. And lady fern, I think one reason that it can tolerate this a little better is that it goes dormant. Some of our ferns are evergreen, like sword fern, which is evergreen. And when plants are dormant, they can handle saturated conditions a little better than when they're still trying to photosynthesize and respire when they're living. But you know, it's mid-June now, and this plant has been growing for a while. One thing that it does, you probably have heard of this in the past, is that as the fronds are emerging, they kind of uncoil, and the coil at the top looks a little bit like a fiddlehead. So some people call these fiddlehead ferns, which is a term that I think is useful, but can be a little confusing because we also often hear that the fiddleheads are edible, and some are much better than others. So the most prized fiddlehead is from the fiddlehead fern, which is a species that grows in the northeast woodlands, but doesn't grow in western Washington. Now you can eat these fiddleheads, but they're not as tasty as the fiddlehead fern, the different species altogether. Now, this isn't a wild edibles class, but just for your interest, if you do want to eat these, you want to get them a little earlier in the year. You want to strip off all the side leaves so that you're just eating the shoot minus the side, or the leaflets, and minus the hairs that are found along the stem. And then you want to boil them and eat them. But let's talk about some identification features for the the lady fern, Ethereum felix femina. This fern has fronds. This is called a frond instead of a leaf, that taper from being very narrow at the tip to being quite wide in the middle, and then going all the way down to being narrow at the end. So overall, it looks like a giant football or something in shape, or a ellipse. It's elliptical in shape. And that is a good distinguishing feature. Another good distinguishing feature is that it grows in clumps. So if we look around over to the right there are three ferns there, and you can see that each of them has its own clump. I'm standing in a clump here of 2 ferns. So at the base of these clumps, all the fronds are coming together. Some of our other species have fronds that just arise out of the ground individually. They're arise out of the ground out of a long rhizome that stretches underground. But the rhizome of the fiddlehead, the lady fern, Ethereum felix femina, the rhizome is just in a ball, and so all the fronds are coming out of the same place. So those are good features for the lady fern. All right, let's go over to some trees now. Okay, I'm next to 2 trees, and our trees in western Washington generally don't like growing out of ground that's saturated all year long. And that's true of a lot of woody plants. They just can't handle those permanently saturated conditions. They don't have the adaptations that some of the herbaceous plants do for moving air down into the root zone, so that the living tissue that's under there, it also needs to respire. And so it needs gas exchange, needs to exchange gas to do that. And yeah, our trees don't have the pneumatophores that some of the cypress trees down in the swamps in the southeast do. So they just tend to grow kind of on the margins of the swamps or on hummocks inside the swamp. And that's the case here. There's a little mound here, and you know, maybe there used to be another tree here that is partially decomposed, and these trees are growing on an old tip-up mound from a tree or something. It's hard to say at this point. It's obviously a long time ago. These are big trees. It could be 80 years or 60 years ago that they germinated. So 2 of our conifers that can handle saturated conditions for at least part of the year are the western red cedar and the Sitka spruce. And so I'll talk about some features of them. So this is the western red cedar, Thuya plicata. You know, I really recommend, as you're watching these videos, to follow along with your book or a plant list, or at least a piece of paper, so that you could write down some of these words and names and take notes. So features of the Thuya plicata are this bark, which has grooves that are very much vertical in nature, and they have really long grooves. Sometimes they snake a little bit across each other. Another good feature are the the needles, they're actually scales. So they're not needles, they're scales, and they're modified leaves. So in conifers, they could either be modified into a needle-like leaf or a scale-like leaf. And these have scale-like leaves that are kind of flattened. And they have really small cones. Yeah, those are all good features. The bark is really important as a weaving material, incidentally, and so are the roots to the Coast Salish and other people along the northwest coast. And next to the cedar here is a different tree called the Sitka spruce, Picea sitchensis. And I could identify the Sitka spruce by the bark features alone. I often do from the road or a trail. Especially if the branches are up high, it's hard to see them. Now the Sitka spruce bark is distinctive in that it flakes off in these almost potato chip-like flakes. So you can see how they're about the size of a potato chip. I guess some of these are pretty well attached. There we go. It doesn't have long grooves. There's this kind of circular pattern to the bark. Another good feature is the cone, which hangs from the branch, so it attaches here on the branch. And it doesn't have any bracts underneath the scales. They're just all scales, and they tend to be between an inch and a half long. So the Sitka spruce has needle-like leaves, and if you touch the needles, they are very sharp on the end. It's sharp enough that they'll actually hurt when you touch them. And if you pull off one of the needles and rub it between your fingers, it's actually square, and so it'll roll between your fingers. Whereas a lot of our other conifer needles are flat, more like two-sided rather than four-sided. So when you try and roll them, they don't roll. The Sitka spruce does roll because a square is, kind of almost circular and rolls. All right, so Sitka spruce and western red cedar are the two most common conifers found in wetlands. Sometimes you might see an occasional western hemlock, but usually those are growing like out of logs that are floating on top of the muck, or just suspended between hummocks a little bit above the ground. Now we do actually have quite a few woody shrubs that do fine in wet areas, and so I'm going to point out a lot of those now. So one of the most common shrubs, at least in this swamp, and commonly in many other swamps, is red osier dogwood, Cornus stolonifera, or in some books you might see it written as Cornus sericea. And the dogwood is in its own family, and the family always has, almost always has, opposite leaves. So what does that mean? Well, here this leaf is directly opposite this leaf on the twig. And how do we know that these are leaves and this whole thing isn't a leaf? Well, especially later in the year, each leaf is associated with a bud. So we could kind of see two little buds that are forming. Those are next year's leaves. So a leaf is classically composed of a petiole, the stalk, and a blade. And all of that is folded up tightly inside of the bud. So in the early spring, since it's already sprouted out of the bud, you're not going to see a bud, but as the year progresses, those buds will get bigger and bigger. This leaf will fall off. The leaf will then be kind of dormant inside the bud all winter long, and then in the spring it'll burst out of that bud. So anyway, we can tell that this is a leaf because it has a bud associated with it, and that these leaves are opposite. Another good feature for dogwoods is the veination on the leaf. So it's often easier to see the veins on the back side of the leaf, and we can see that these veins all arch towards the tip of the leaf. This is something called arcuate veination, and that's a good feature for all dogwoods. They have arcuate veination. And there's another test you can do. Actually, one of my early TAs taught me this test. It's called, he called it the dogwood test. And if you break the dogwood leaf, the veins inside of the, or there's a nerve inside of the leaf veins that's a little bit stretchy. And so even though it looks like the leaf is completely severed, those veins are still, oops, it was completely severed. The veins are still attached. Because they're stretchy, they can still be attached and make it look like the leaf is magically floating the bottom half. All right, look at that. Dogwood magic. So that's the dogwood test. And red osier dogwood is called red osier because the stems are reddish tinged. They can also be green. See, on the backside it's green, but they frequently have this reddish tinge. And the flowers of red osier dogwood are born in these kind of domed shaped clusters. It's a cyme. And they have white petals. All the dogwoods have white petals. This one is done flowering and is starting to produce young fruit. And incidentally, when those fruit ripen, they'll be white as well. And that's not the case for all species of dogwood, but the red osier dogwood has white berries and they're fairly bitter. Not poisonous, but in my opinion, not very good tasting. So the dogwoods here are pretty tall. This one is probably 11 feet tall. But they're not always this tall. I think because we're in a swamp where there are trees overhead, everything is really straining upwards to get access to light. So let's see if we can find any other shrubs. Here's a shrub that can actually get a little taller than the red osier dogwood and is sometimes considered a small tree. This is called Oregon crabapple or Pacific crabapple, Malus fusca, F-U-S-C-A. And some good features for identifying the Malus fusca are the leaves. So it's called crabapple, and it's actually in the same genus as the apples that we eat from the grocery store. But the leaves look quite a bit different from the domesticated apples. So the domesticated apple leaves don't have any lobes, they're just kind of elliptic, or ovate maybe. But these leaves will often have two little lobes on the sides. On some occasions they'll just have one, and some of them might not have any lobes. Like this one, it's torn but doesn't really have any lobes. This one doesn't have any lobes. But here's one with one lobe. So it might take a little bit of scrutiny to determine whether it's a crabapple or a domesticated apple. But look at a dozen or 2 dozen leaves and you should be able to find at least a couple that have lobes if it is indeed a crabapple. Now the crabapple can handle wetter conditions than the domesticated apple. And the crabapple trunk usually doesn't get bigger than about 6 inches in diameter, and the tree might get to be 20 feet tall. And it can handle a variety of habitats. We see it in swamps. We also see it on coastal bluffs sometimes, which is drastically different because usually coastal bluffs are very well drained. But I'm teaching this plant as a swamp plant because it is found here, even though it can tolerate other environments. Now you might be wondering, oh, it's called an apple, crabapple. is it edible? And it is actually edible. It's quite sour, but I think it's a delicious sour. And it gets a little bit sweeter after a frost. So it's best to harvest in like October. And an elder that I worked with, he said that his favorite time to eat them was after a frost, and you could just suck the fruit right off of the clusters. They grow more in clusters of maybe 3 to 8 or so. And you could just put the whole cluster in your mouth, slurp them right off. He called that the kumduch stage. And they certainly are sweeter then. Another traditional way of preparing them is to harvest them just as they're starting to ripen, and then actually put them underwater for several months, and that leaches out the bitterness and the sourness, and then you just are left with a nice sweet applesauce textured food. This is perhaps the most common tree in our swamps, because many of our swamps are a little younger and don't have conifers in them. This is a deciduous tree, red alder, Alnus rubra, and it's called that because when you scar the bark, it will immediately, or maybe after 2 minutes, it'll turn a red color, almost like it's bleeding. Now, red alder leaves are serrated, but they're not super sharply serrated. What else can I say about red alder? It doesn't have any catkins right now, but it's in the birch family, the Betulaceae, and all members of the Betulaceae have catkins. We actually have 2 different tree families that have catkins, which are kind of like an aggregation of flowers all packed onto this little cylindrical dangly thing. So the birches, the hazels, and alders are all in that Betulaceae, the birch family. Our other family that has catkins is the willow family. The bark of the red alder has these little lenticels in them when the bark's young, and these are little breathing pores. And when the bark is young, it tends to be fairly greenish. Then this is kind of intermediate age where it's starting to turn kind of a dark gray, and we can see these little blotches. These are actually lichen colonies that are starting to form. So as the tree gets older, those lichen colonies will expand and eventually dominate the whole trunk, giving the tree a white appearance that makes it look a lot like a birch. But alder bark doesn't peel, whereas birch bark does peel quite a bit. So I'm going to just take a little scar the bark here, just so that we can see it turn red. It's going to take a little bit, so we'll pause and come back to you when it turns red. So we can see that it's started to blush red, sort of a peach color actually right now, but if I make a fresh one next to it, we can see that that's still like white and green, whereas this is kind of peach and orange colored. So we got the important trees and shrubs from this site. Let's talk about some herbaceous plants. Beside me here is one called Pacific water parsley, Oenanthe sarmentosa. This is in the carrot family, which is a family that has a few wetland members. The Apiaceae is the name of the carrot family. Anyway, carrot family plants always have a umbel-shaped flower head. So sometimes they're compound umbels, sometimes they're just single umbels. Umbel means kind of umbrella-shaped, so all the flowers attach back to one point in the same way that the spokes of an umbrella all kind of connect back to one point. And this is young, so it's a little bit hard to see that, but here is a little teeny umbel right there, and another little teeny umbel right there. And you can see there's maybe 10 umbels all together, all connecting themselves back to one point, making it a compound umbel. So some features that are specific to the Pacific water parsley, Oenanthe sarmentosa. are a bare stem. So some carrots have a hairy stem. This one is hairless, it's smooth. And then the way it branches is, I think, pretty distinctive and gives it a little bit of a sprawling appearance. So it has this kind of lanky stem and leaves that emerge alternately up the stem. Okay, so down low it has a leaf. Here it has another one that's on the other side from this one. Up here it's back on that side, so it alternates sides as it goes up. And another distinctive thing is the flower shoots all come from the leaf axils. So again, this is a petiole, and it connects to the stem here. And where it meets, that's called an axil. And another flowering shoot or stem emerges from that axil. So here's another one up higher. The petiole meets the stem here, and then we have this shoot coming out from the axil. Now, this particular plant is kind of reaching up for the sun because it's growing in amongst the skunk cabbages. This plant can do pretty well in shadier areas where it generally lays flat on the ground. And when these axils are on the ground, it can root. So that's called adventitious rooting, and enables, it's like a vegetative way for the plant to expand rapidly rather than reproducing by seeds, which is good in shady areas because it's hard for flowers to get much attention from pollinators when they're growing in shady areas. So there's actually another member of the carrot family. I'm not going to go into detail about this one until we see it again in a later wetland where it's more common. But so we could compare the leaves. We can see that many carrot family plants have highly dissected leaves. This one is, just has a few leaflets, whereas this one has many, many leaflets. In fact, we say that this is a pinnately compound leaf because pinnae in Latin means feather, and the ribs of a feather all connect to a central axis. And you can think of that as an analogy where we have these petioles or petiolate branches that all connect to the central petiole. And it's not only once pinnate, it's actually twice pinnate because on each of those branches it has further branches that connect to it. So highly pinnately compound leaf on this Oenanthe sarmentosa, whereas this other carrot relative, it's not quite so complex. Just once pinnate. These are lobes, not pinnae here, but yeah. In slightly drier parts of the swamp, you might find, here underneath the skunk cabbage in this case, you might find a plant called false lily of the valley, or Meanthammum dilatatum. And you can see that this plant has formed a really beautiful ground cover here. It can extend rhizominously or reproduce by these little berries that are mottled kind of green with red spots earlier in the year, but later in the year they'll be red. They turn a uniform red color. And you could try and eat them. They're not going to harm you, but they have a pretty big seed and they're not super tasty. Anyway, false lily of the valley is distinctive in that it has this heart shape, and it has all the veins extend from the base all the way to the tip. And this is something that we call parallel veination. Now they're not exactly parallel in this case because they have to swoop so far out to the side, but none of the veins branch. So the other type of veination is called branching veination. Now parallel veination is indicative of all the monocots. So plants are almost at the broadest level divided up into monocots and dicots. and this has to do with how they germinate as seeds. So when the first leaves come out, do they have one leaf or do they have two leaves? If they just have one leaf, they're called monocots. Anyway, all the monocots also have parallel veins, and all the dicots, they have two cotyledon leaves, or kind of almost embryonic leaves, and they have some other type of venation, net or branching venation. Here is a scouring rush, Equisetum hyamale, and it's related to horsetails, the Equisetaceae, the horsetail family, and it's different than most other horsetails in that it doesn't have any side branches or leaves, really. It's just the central shoot, and all the photosynthetic tissue is in that central shoot. They generally grow in sandy areas, and sometimes the river side wetlands are a good place for them, but it's not an obligate wetland species. It'll grow in non-wetland riversides that are sandy. This is the new shoot, this is the mature shoot, and we could just see that this hasn't developed all of its photosynthetic capacity yet. It's not fully green yet. And it expands between the nodes rather than having all the meristem at the tip like a lot of other plants. This has meristem at each node, and so the nodes will grow apart from each other. Equisetum hyamale, or scouring rush. It's called scouring rush because it's really rough. A texture that might be called scabrose in the botanical world, and is used by Native Americans as a sandpaper, actually, for sanding wood. Here is red elderberry, Sambucus racemosa. Now, racemose, or raceme rather, is a type of flower where the flowers are attached to little stalks that are all connected to a main stalk. So you hear that term a lot in scientific names, and it's always indicative of that flower structure. This plant has opposite leaves, and they're pinnately compound leaves. So this one has 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 leaflets, which is fairly common for the red elderberry. And they always have the opposite leaves. And this shrub doesn't always grow in wetlands, and a lot of the plants we've covered today aren't obligate wetland plants. So some will also grow outside of wetlands, but I'm trying to break you into learning some plants. I'm trying to give you some easier plants to start with, and including some that are often found in wetlands, but not all the time. So red elderberry is in that category of, often being in swamps, but it does not in and of itself indicate that we're in a swamp. Red elderberry has a pithy stem. If you break it open, it's white on the inside and not woody, but this pith is, geez, that sun is probably making it hard to see, but it's really spongy. I could just squish it. So the inside of the stem is filled with that pith, and that just enables the plant to grow really quickly because it doesn't have to produce wood, which is energetically expensive to produce. So you can see that this whole shoot from here all the way up to here is that's probably just about 6 feet of growth, is all one season of growth in just the last 2 months, probably, maybe 2.5 months. Now, the fruit of red elderberry and the flower, as I mentioned, grow on these racemes. So, so this is the central stalk, and then each flower and fruit have its own individual stalk. It's noisy here. And the berries will ripen to red. They're green now, but they'll ripen to a red. And these racemes are kind of conical in shape. All right, just a couple more plants for this site and then we'll head to Tennant Lake. Here's a plant called fool's huckleberry or false azalea, rhododendron menziesii. It used to be called menziesii ferrugina, but it's now in the rhododendron genus and the heath family, the Ericaceae. Anyway, one reason it was called fool's huckleberry is that the flowers look a little bit like a huckleberry flower. They have these urn-shaped flowers, and bees specialize in pollinating these. They land on the bottom of the flower and they flex their wing muscles and vibrate the flower, and the pollen will fall onto the bees. But false azalea is one that shows up in swamps and also in bogs, along the margins of bogs especially. And let's see, other features are these elliptical leaves that look like they kind of grow in whorls. And instead of having a berry like a real huckleberry, the plants produce capsules, dry capsules. So rhododendrons all produce capsules. And this is on its way to becoming a capsule. So there's the flower with the emerging fruit, the dry fruit, which will split in at the top, and the seeds will shake out of that capsule. All right, that's the false azalea. All right, beside me here is a small tree or big shrub called cascara, and usually they only get to be about 30 feet tall, and I guess usually they have a single trunk, which makes them more tree-like, but they're not as tall as some other trees. Anyway, cascara has these leaves that have smooth margins and are fairly elliptical. They generally don't have really pointy tips, although that one's a little bit pointy. Sometimes they're even flat on the tip of the leaf. One of the best leaf features for cascara is turning it over and looking at the veins. They're really prominent veins on the underside. They look a little bit like dogwood, but you could see that they just kind of angle to the side. They don't arch all the way towards the tip. And then another feature, especially in the summer and fall, is if you look at the buds. These are next year's leaves. Usually on almost all other plants, the buds are enclosed underneath a scale or multiple scales. And the future leaves are, are enclosed underneath those scales. But this one doesn't have any scales on top. You could just see the embryonic leaves. If you look really carefully, you could see the veins all folded up and tight right on the tip. So people call this a naked bud, a bud without any protective scales. So when we go to Tennant Lake, we're going to be looking and actually keying out some willows. So I've covered a lot of what I would consider to be fairly easy trees and shrubs. If you've taken another class, maybe you've seen some of them already. But we're going to go to Tennant Lake and key out some willows, which are a more difficult group. We'll cover 4 different species. And the buds of willows are different in that they have scales, but they just have 2 scales, one on top and one on bottom. And so that's like the next step that's more complex than having no scales on the bud. And some other plants have, probably 20 or 30 scales that are all kind of shingled together to protect that embryonic leaf. So the scientific name for the cascara is, it's now Frangula persiana. Some of the older books will probably call it Rhamnus persiana. And again, the common name is cascara. And this plant is used traditionally in this area as a laxative, and that tradition is not just from this area, but there are other closely related species that also have laxative properties, and so it's been actually used as a laxative from all over the world. And today a lot of commercial laxatives are produced from this bark. It used to be that the bark was wild harvested, and like in the 20s and 30s and 40s, a lot of people and also a lot of Native Americans went out into the woods and collected cascara bark and sold it to pharmacies, and the pharmacies produced their own laxative from the distillates of the bark. But now I think the cascara trees are grown on plantations, and that's all done industrially. Okay, so we have explored this swamp, call it a spruce or cedar swamp, dominated by, you know, spruce and cedar trees in the overstory, and the understory by plants that really like it wet, like skunk cabbage, lady fern, and the water parsley. So next we're going to go to, you know, and there are quite a bit of shrubs here too, but next we're going to go to Tennant Lake and explore another woody plant wetland called a shrub wetland that doesn't have this overstory of tall trees, but is really thickly dominated by shrubby plants. And we may see a few of the same plants, like that we'll probably see red osier dogwood there, but we'll also see some new species that really thrive in these shrub wetlands. I hope you enjoyed the instantaneous van ride to Tennant Lake Park. That's where we are now. This is a great spot to look at both marshes, we'll come here later, and also shrub and kind of old wet field wetlands. Anyway, I'm going to cover a few shrubs first. This here is black hawthorn, and black hawthorn gets to be maybe at most 25 feet tall. Usually I see it around like 10 or 15 feet tall. And it is called hawthorn because it is, well, I think it's called hawthorn at least because of the thorns. Very stout, sharp-pointed thorns. And these are among the worst thorns to get poked by because the little tip seems to break off in your skin. And every time I get poked, or actually even just scratched by black hawthorn, it tends to get really inflamed and sometimes infected. There might be some compounds in there also that are that cause that inflammation. Black hawthorn leaves, this is a young leaf, or a leaf from a young twig. Usually leaves on young twigs are a little bigger than on second and older year twigs. Anyway, same plant here. Some characteristics are that the margin is serrated, but the margin does not have any lobes. So a lobed leaf would be like an oak or a maple, big indentations into the leaf. Some hawthorns actually have those lobes, particularly one that grows in the lowlands here called Crataegus monogyna, or one-seeded hawthorn, deeply lobed. But our native black hawthorn, Crataegus, well, actually there are two that we call black hawthorn, Crataegus douglasii and Crataegus suxdorfii. And the difference is just the number of stamens. One has 10 stamens and one has 20 stamens. Fortunately, a lot of people just lump them as one species, so we'll just call this the douglasii, Crataegus douglasii. Anyway, the margins are not lobed on this, and it has fruit that will ripen to a black color with some hints of purple. When it's fully ripe, it's mostly black. You can see that right now it's kind of a apple, green, and red. It's actually in the rose family, so closely related to an apple. And like apples, the sepals wither and are persistent, wither but don't fall off. They're persistent on the tip of the fruit. And if we break one of these open, ow, just stabbed myself. we could see that it has several seeds inside, as opposed to another difference between that and the Quercus or Crataegus monogyna, which just has one seed. Mono meaning one, and gyna meaning seed, essentially. Doesn't technically mean seed, but it's like the female structure of the flower that ends up being the seed. Okay, I think those are the main features for the Crataegus douglasii, and the wood is really tough, so if you ever needed to make a makeshift tool handle, this would be a good choice for making a tool handle because the wood is really strong. You know, I mentioned that it's related to an apple, and some people actually graft their apple scion onto rootstock from hawthorn, and it'll take. You could graft apples and pears onto hawthorn. And what's the benefit to that? Well, if you live in a really wet place, it's hard to get rootstock that thrives in a wet environment. And black hawthorn likes growing in wet areas, not saturated all year round, but seasonally wet soils. And so that could be a good use of a native species to cross it with or graft it onto an introduced fruit-bearing species. You can eat the black hawthorn fruit, but they're pretty mealy and not sweet. So here is a twig from the Crataegus monogyna, the one-seeded hawthorn, and we could see how the leaves are deeply lobed as opposed to the unlobed leaves of the Crataegus douglasii, the black hawthorn. One of the things I like about Tennant Lake here is that it has a boardwalk, and you can just walk right through a swamp, which is usually really hard to do because they're so wet. But it's a good place to see a swamp. You can see there's standing water and trees and shrubs. Some areas of the boardwalk actually shoot out into an area that doesn't have any big trees. It's all shrubs, so that's the shrub wetland part. But there aren't very many places around where you could walk through a swamp or a shrub wetland with any sort of ease. One time I was doing this and I actually stepped off the boardwalk and fell into the water, so I'm going to try and pay a little more attention. You know, the best way to study for this class is actually to visit some of the sites that I take you on these virtual field trips. And if you live in Bellingham or Ferndale, this is going to be an easy one to come to. It's open, so come on over if you get the chance, and you could look at the same plants that I'm looking at. Okay, a few herbaceous plants that I want you to learn. You know, the focus has been on trees and shrubs, but this is a good one. This is called jewelweed. Impatiens capensis is the scientific name. And I don't think it's doing it yet, but it has these seed clusters that if you just touch them when they're fully ripe, they explode and they shoot the seeds a pretty long distance. So that's the seed dispersal mechanism. Unlike some of the trees which use the wind to disperse the seeds, this one has an explosive, a dehiscent it's called. Well, that means splitting, I think, but anyway, seed structure. So let's see, this is not a shrub, it's a herb, so it has an annual shoot that comes up every year, and serrated leaf margins. It has yellow flowers that are gone right now, and those exploding seed heads. Here is black twinberry, Lonicera involucrata. Now, this is in the honeysuckle family, the Caprifoliaceae, and the honeysuckle family always has opposite leaves. So you can see this leaf is directly opposite that one. And here is, I depict this from a dark area. It's hard to film in this dappled light, but this is one that has flowers and fruit on it. And we can see that the fruit are surrounded by this bract that is really reddish. And right now the fruit is green, but it'll turn black. That's why it's called black twinberry, because inside each of these, or right there's actually 2 fruit, and here is another 2 fruit. So everything about this plant is in pairs. the leaves are in pairs. There are 2 flower stems, and each of those flowering stems has 2 flowers and 2 fruits. The flowers are yellow. It's obviously done flowering now, and the fruit will ripen to a very black, shiny black berry. And traditionally, the berry actually is used as a paint, so you could squeeze it and stain things with it. So fairly broad, or not broad, fairly long, pointy leaves, and a wimpy but slightly woody stem are good features for the black twinberry, Lonicera involucrata. Here's a classic shrub wetland plant. This is called Myrica gale, or sweet gale is the common name. I think it's one of the easiest scientific names to remember because neither word sounds all that difficult. Myrica, M-Y-R-I-C-A, Myrica, and gale, G-A-L-E. And this is a very fragrant shrub. Again, what is it about wetland plants and fragrance? If you crush these seeds and smell them, they just smell divine. You could get some of that smell from the leaves too, but those little clusters of, they're almost like cones, but they're clusters of seeds that are the most fragrant part. Some other features, well, it has a long leaf with a slightly serrated margin. It flowers pretty early in the spring. It has these little dainty flowers right along the top of the stem that I believe are pink. And the stem itself is covered with lenticels in kind of a purple-black color. And usually you see this growing right out of water. I'd say it's one of our most adapted species to saturated soil conditions. It seems to grow fine in permanently saturated soils. We would otherwise call this a marsh, except that it has woody plants in it, and so we call it a shrub wetland. And you know, it's able to get taller than a lot of other woody plants and keep out the herbaceous marsh plants for the most part. So this is Myrica gale. Let me show one other over here. We have, this is also Myrica gale, and here we see these buds. Same plant, just different structure. So there are males and females. So this is the male here. The male flowers were coming out of those little bud things. And this is the female plant here. And the female flowers turn into the seeds. So we call that dioecious, which means that the male and female plants are, or flowers are in different plants. So this here is the male plant, and over here we have the female plant. Okay, another shrub wetland plant often grows with Myrica, but this plant actually has a broader, at least it's found, I find it much more commonly than Myrica, so it probably has a broader habitat tolerance. This is called Douglas spirea, or hardhack, sometimes people say. I think that name probably comes from surveyors that were trying to walk along section boundaries in perfectly straight lines and had to go through wetlands filled with this, which must just be a nightmare. I mean, I can't imagine doing it. Okay, so not only is it found in similar places, but I think the leaves look kind of similar to the Myrica. Here, I'll pull up here's the Myrica leaf with kind of serrations towards the tip and long leaf, longer than wide. And we can see that the hardhack leaf is similar, it's just way bigger. And if you look really carefully, the hardhack doesn't have sort of a resin-dotted leaf surface like the Myrica does. It's those resin glands that release that aromatic compound. But anyway, I'm supposed to be done talking about Myrica. So Douglas spirea has a pyramid-shaped inflorescence. Again, an inflorescence is the cluster of flowers. And this time of the year, they're just starting to bloom. We could see, here's one that hasn't yet started blooming yet. This is last year's inflorescence. They persist for a really long time. When I was here in the spring, they still had dried flowers on it, but now most of the dried flowers have fallen off. That's probably about all I want to say about Douglas spirea, or Spirea douglasii. Now, David Douglas he didn't name all these plants after himself, but douglasii is a very common species epithet, or the second part of the scientific name is called the species epithet. The first part is the genus. Anyway, he was one of the first botanists in the area. Only Lewis and Clark did some botanical collection, of course, down at the mouth of the Columbia, and Archibald Menzies did some botanical collection in the Puget Sound in 1792. Lewis and Clark were here in 1804, 1805, or maybe 1805, 1806. David Douglas was exploring Washington and Oregon and parts of Idaho, largely by foot, in I think between about 1820 and maybe into the 1830s. And he was mainly interested in things with pretty flowers, and he was shipping seeds back to the Royal Horticultural Society in England, and they would plant those seeds and grow the plants and sell them to landscape or rich people with estates that needed all the new and latest cultivated varieties or just exotic species. So anyway, David Douglas must have also been attracted to these beautiful flowers, collected seeds, and he also collected a lot of voucher specimens, and later botanists realized that these were new species and names many of them in his honor. Okay, so this here is the bark of a plant called nine bark. I think it's called that because some people think that there are 9 layers of bark. Anyway, there's obviously many layers. This is Physocarpus capitata, Pacific nine bark. So the bark is a good feature, but let's take a look at some of the other features. Up a little higher at the top of the plant, we can see that it has these head-like clusters of flowers. Now cap, like a ball cap. Well, cap actually means head. They're fruiting now. When they're flowering, they're white, and they're really, they look like popcorn balls that somebody glued to the top of a tree. When I was like 8 years old, I called this the popcorn tree. It's actually a shrub. So anyway, these round clusters of seeds and flowers are a good feature. The leaves are kind of maple-shaped, and they're hairless, or the term glabrous is what you might see in your book, which means smooth or hairless. There are a lot of different words for hairy structures. So some of like the hooker's willow, you might describe the underside of the leaf as lanate, which is like a thick woolly hair layer, or ciliate, which is kind of sparsely haired, especially long hairs. I'm sure we'll come across many other hair terms. Pubescent, which just means hairy. All right, so Pacific nine bark is not hairy. I don't know, I'm rambling on about hairiness right now. Oh, because it's glabrous, that's why. Hairless. And likes, swampy areas. I see it under trees quite often, like at the Hearst Trail at the south end of Lake Whatcom. When you're walking through the swampy areas there's tons of nine bark. But I can't go everywhere for this course, so I'll just limit myself to 2 spots. Okay, we've covered a lot of species so far. Most of them are pretty common, and many of them are quite recognizable, things that you might actually already know. But I want to add a little bit of challenge. I'm going to talk about a few grass-like plants and some willows to round out this week's unit. And we're actually, in future units, going to dive more into the grasses, sedges, and rushes, all plants that are commonly called graminoids, which is a life form that includes 3 different families, at least, plant families. But I just want to give you a quick overview of the 3, how to distinguish the grasses, the sedges, and the rushes, and then teach you the first sedge that we'll learn. So here is just this kind of swampy ground with a shrub here and some old field next to it. And this is I got all 3 species growing here, or 3 families. So we'll start with this one. This is a rush, and there's a mnemonic. People say sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses have joints all the way to the ground. And so let me explain that mnemonic a bit. So this is a rush, and it's round. I can roll it easily in my finger. The stem, or culm it's called for graminoids, is the the structure that supports the flower on a graminoid. And rushes have a round culm, okay? And it tends to lack joints. Okay, so rushes are round. How about sedges? So the mnemonic says sedges have edges, and sometimes you have to be careful with the edginess of the sedges because they can be really sharp and cut you. In fact, I recently was cut bad enough to need stitches by a sedge, so I'm going to use my knife to cut the sedge and show you. Okay, so this is a sedge, and I've cut it down near the base. All of this actually is attached at the root. So these are the leaves, and this is the flowering stem, which is called a culm. All right, so with sedges, the culm actually is the thing that has edges. So in some cases that edge is sharp to the touch. On this particular one, it's the leaves that actually could do the cutting. But this culm in cross section is angled. It is triangular in cross section, and that is the edginess of a sedge. Okay, so all the members of the Carex genus, which this is part of, have culms that are roughly triangular. They're never square or round, but sometimes the edges of the triangle are a little bit rounded. So there's another look at the culm cross section. Okay, and some more just quick things about sedge anatomy, because this is actually one that I want you to learn for this week. This is called slough sedge, or Carex obnupta. So sedges have flowers in clusters. Cluster flowers is called an inflorescence. And furthermore, with sedges, we use some specialized terminology, and we call that cluster flower a spikelet. So sometimes the spikelets are dangly like this, which is actually a good feature for identifying this Carex obnupta, or slough sedge. Dangling spikelets, and we have male spikelets on the top and female spikelets down below. So it has both sexes on one plant, which means that it is monoecious. Both sexes in one house. Monoecious literally means one house. But all the female flowers and now seeds are on one spikelet. There are the seeds. And I'll tell you what those are called in a later unit. They have a specialized term. And all the male flowers that release pollen are on these 3 other spikelets. Okay, so that's just a taste. There's definitely a lot more to sedge anatomy and identification, but this is one of our most distinct, I think, sedges, and it's very common in swamps, and so that's why I want to teach it to you now. I'm going to take a break and let this helicopter pass. All right, the Border Patrol decided that I wasn't a serious threat and they moved on. Maybe they were worried about the type of grass I was teaching you. So next we get to grasses, and this is a common weedy species called reed canary grass. It's not on the study list for this week, but a good chance if you go out into your backyard and you find a tall grass and maybe not your backyard, but a old field, it could be reed canary grass. So the pneumonic sedges have edges. We saw rushes are round. We saw, and grasses have joints. And so this is a joint. Okay, so the culm is here, and along the culm we see these joints. Okay, bamboo also has joints. They're just nodes. So growth kind of happens. Never mind, scratch that. I don't know how that relates to growth, but somehow nodes relate to growth. This is a good feature of all the grasses, is that they have these nodes or joints. So that's how you tell a grass, a sedge, and a rush apart. And so I'm just going to get a shot of all the distinctive features in one. The sedge is triangular, it has edges. The rush is round, and the grass has those nodes. Now grasses are also round, so to distinguish a grass from a rush, you need to look for those nodes. Okay, I'm going to teach you 4 different willow species today, and these are the 4 most common species in the lowlands of western Washington. And I think the easiest one to learn is this one here, called Salix lasiandra, or Pacific willow. And it has several features that are just much different than the rest of them. Okay, so one good feature is these long acuminate tips. See how long pointed the tips are? Another very distinctive feature is that the margins are serrated. A lot of the other willows have smooth margins. And then another good feature is the yellowness of the twig. Okay, so some other general willow characteristics. All willows have alternate leaves. Many willows have these things called stipules, which are leaf-like structures where the petiole meets the twig, the stem. So I talked about, I mentioned stipules when we were looking at the stink currant, because it has hairs instead of a stipule. And then hairiness is a good thing to pay attention to. The Pacific willow, the Salix lucida, is not hairy. No hairs on the upper surface of the leaf. It's kind of whitish, but doesn't have any hairs on the lower surface of the leaf. Now, willows are in their own family, the Salicaceae, the willow family, and it is another family that has catkins. And willows are, another word we just learned, they're dioecious, so they have male plants and female plants. The male flowers are in one plant and the female flowers are in another plant. And it has a different type of catkin for each one. So the female catkins release seeds that are usually very fluffy and similar to cottonwood seeds, which is a member of the willow family, the Salicaceae. And the male catkins, they just, once they release their pollen, they basically wither and die. Now, willows tend to do their catkin production pretty early in the spring. And the Salix lasiandra, it has a yellow female catkin. Or sorry, it's the male catkin. The anthers are very yellow on it. And that's a distinctive feature. Again, that yellowness, which is part of one of the scientific names, the synonym. So I think that's all I want to say about this one. A lot of willows are very flexible. They grow really fast. You know, they have medicinal value. Those aspirin is a derivative of the willow bark. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Found a willow, a Pacific willow here that still has some catkins on it. So these are the female catkins, which are always going to be a little, persist a little bit longer. We can see how some of the fluff is starting to burst out of the little capsules. So, long pointed serrated leaves of the Pacific willow with the female catkins. Okay, a different willow here. This is Sitka willow, Salix sitchensis. And there's one like guarantee feature for Sitka willow and a bunch of minor features. But let's compare it. Actually, right next to it here we have the Pacific willow leaf. And we can see that the Sitka willow leaves are often much smaller, and that tip might be a little bit pointy, but it doesn't have that long acuminate tip. It's more of an abrupt tip. And the margins are smooth, they're not serrated. Okay, so those are good ways to tell it apart from the Sitka willow, but the fail-safe feature for the, or to tell it apart from the Pacific willow, the fail-safe feature for the Sitka willow, Salix sitchensis, is looking at the underside of the leaf, which is covered with fine hairs, okay? And there's a special thing about these hairs. You ever use one of those little cards as a kid where there's actually two images and you change the position slightly and it'll alternate from one to the other image? Well, the underside of the Sitka willow leaf kind of does that. The hairs reflect light in a way that it appears white from one angle, and then when you turn it to another angle, it suddenly changes to like a green color. Okay, so Sitka willow, it actually generally doesn't get quite as tall as the Pacific willow. The Pacific willow gets to be a tree in size. The Sitka willow tends to be under 20 feet tall. It still has stipules at the base of the leaves. And the twig isn't usually a yellowish color. You can see this is kind of a, what is that, an orangish, coppery color on the first year twigs, and the second year twigs are usually kind of more of a tan. Okay. So I think that's the second easiest willow to identify, just by that two-tone quality of the leaves. But other willows still have hairy leaves on the bottom. We're going to see one of those next. Okay, a third willow species here, also growing in fairly saturated soils. This is the Hooker's willow, Salix hookeriana, that's it. Anyway, this willow, from a distance, you could tell that the leaves are wider than any of the ones we've learned so far. The underside of the leaves are covered with a dense hair. And I use the underside of these leaves as a good, reliable identification characteristic. But don't be fooled with the Sitka Salix sitchensis, which is here on the right. These hairs are really, really fine and have that two-tone quality, whereas the hairs on the Hooker's willow are more of a matte finish. They're longer and thicker, and they have a little bit of a rusty brown hue to them. And turn the leaf over, and let me find one that has more of it. Some of the young leaves, especially the young leaves, they'll have a fine coat of these rusty brown hairs in the spring and early summer. Later in the summer, that'll wear off. So broader leaves, fairly big leaves overall, felted hairs on the underside, and growing close to the ocean are all good characters of the Hooker's willow. Okay, only one more to go. We're covering the lowland willows. Let's look for the Schooler's willow is the last one I'm going to teach you. So this is a really good spot on the boardwalk trail where we can see the shrub wetland. You know, really thick Myrica gale and Douglas spirea on either side of the trail. Those seem to be the dominants, with a few Pacific, and there's some frogs, a few Pacific willows and a few Sitka willows. The biggest deciduous tree around here is the black cottonwood. And black cottonwood can tolerate pretty wet conditions and is often found along rivers. It thrives from the disturbance of rivers that shift channels all the time. And the seeds, of course, they can disperse really far, and when they land on bare mineral soil, they tend to germinate pretty well. Above me here is a very large black cottonwood. This is Populus trichocarpa, again a member of the willow family, the Salicaceae. And the top of it's hard to see the leaf features from here, but the top surface of the leaves are really glossy, and the under surface is kind of white. It has thickly furrowed bark. You know, sometimes it looks a little bit like Douglas fir bark, kind of a gray, deeply fissured bark. And from a distance, you really can get a better appreciation for its height and for the thickness of the side limbs. Giant side limbs that stick out. Another good feature. And you know, a week ago there was still cottonwood fluff drifting everywhere, which to me is kind of a harbinger of summer. Usually just as it starts to get warm is when they start to fluff, and usually around the time when the first cinnamon berries are ripe. Okay, this shrub here has opposite leaves, and it used to be placed in the honeysuckle family, but now it's actually a different family, the Adoxaceae. Anyway, this is called high bush cranberry, or native Viburnum eduli, and I hope to point out an introduced species as well that's sometimes confused with this. But some good features. The leaves have been all chewed on by insects, but we could see that there are 3 points on the leaf, but all the points are just up right at kind of almost at the very tip, 90% into the plant. If you can't tell, I'm at home now. But this is a plant that'll grow in riversides and swamps, especially at higher elevation. And it has a red berry and white flowers that are in a kind of a flat-topped cluster. So really good native species and a shrub, and so I threw it in this unit because, well, it grows in swamps, but you probably won't see it in our lowland swamps. You have to get up to about 1,000 to 3,000 feet in elevation before it'll show up, and especially in areas along rivers. Viburnum eduli, eduli meaning edible. So this species is quite tasty. It tastes a lot like cranberry. It's tart, and the fruit are red like cranberries, but they often have some speckling, a little bit like an apple or something like that. How sometimes apples are both red and green. All right, I showed you our native Viburnum eduli, or native high bush cranberry, and I want to compare it to this Viburnum opulus, variety opulus, the European high bush cranberry. I think this was planted here by accident, and that's part of the reason that I want to point it out to you, is because some nurseries are selling this plant as a native because they actually think it's Viburnum eduli. So I'm going to give you a trick for how to distinguish the two. So one of the best features, let's see, is where the leaves, remember I taught you about stipules, the leaves of the Viburnum opulus have stipules, whereas the petiole, the base of the leaf where it attaches to the twig, on the Viburnum edule does not have stipules. All right, another good comparison is that right at the base of the leaf blade, at the top of the petiole, are these glands. The leaves of Viburnum opulus have glands, whereas the leaves of our native Viburnum edule do not have glands. Okay, another feature is the flowers. Stepped on my mic cord. Okay, the flowers, when they're blooming, they will have these bigger white, what are called filaries. They're non-reproductive flowers. They're just kind of advertising for the whole cluster. Anyway, the filary petals are a lot bigger than the reproductive flowers in the center on the Viburnum opulus. But on the Viburnum edule, all the flowers are the same size. There are no filaries. And then another feature is that we could see here that the flower is borne on a twig that has 2 pairs of leaves, whereas the native Viburnum opulus, the flowers are borne on twigs that just have 1 pair of leaves. So there are many features to distinguish this from the native Viburnum edule, but for some reason I see this planted in landscaping. Native plant landscapes, like all the other plants in this landscaping, are native plants, but this one they just screwed up. So I'm on a mission to fix it. We see this more in lowlands because it's an introduced species, usually near humans. The Viburnum edule, it is a marsh or a swamp plant, but I usually only see it above 1,000 feet in elevation and maybe below 3,000 or 3,500 feet in elevation. We don't tend to see it in Western Washington down near the coast in our lowlands swamps. As you move north into British Columbia, though, you will see it in the shrub zone of like estuarine salt, or the fresh zone of an estuary of the marsh. But that doesn't happen here, at least that I've seen so far. One species of rose that'll grow in wetter environments is Rosa pisocarpa, or I think the common name is clustered rose. And here's one that's still flowering. The petals are a little smaller than that of Nootka rose, if you know that, down here. And the fruit, which are starting to form, grow in clusters. Here's 3 altogether. Over here we have 3 altogether. Here's 4 altogether. Whereas the Nootka rose, usually you just have 1 or maybe 2 that are together. It has prickles, mainly concentrated at the base of the leaves, which is similar to Nootka rose. And it has sepals that are persistent on the hip, which is also kind of similar to Nootka rose. So these are sepals. The petals actually fall off once they're done, but the sepals persist. Rosa pisocarpa. Okay, the last of the willows I want to show you is Schuyler's willow, or Salix schülleriana. And this willow tends to have a little bit smaller leaves, and they're broad. And if you were to cut the leaf in half, the broadest point of the leaf would be towards the tip of that halfway point, generally. And the underside of the leaves are sometimes a little bit hairy, and as they age they tend to lose some of their hairs, and they can be totally smooth on the underside. So compared with the hookers, which is very hairy on the underside, this is just moderately hairy, enough that you could clearly see the hairless enough that you could clearly see the veins. What else? The stipules. This Schuyler's willow will have stipules. We could see that there are still some on that twig, but they actually tend to fall off on this species a little bit in the late spring and early summer. so it has deciduous stipules. So another good feature, again, it likes growing in more of an upland habitat. So if you see a willow and you're not really in a wetland, the first thing you suspect would be the schooler's willow. Sitka willow will also sometimes grow in uplands, but the underside of the leaf is very different from the Sitka. It doesn't have that two-tone nature. So that's it for the willows, and actually I think I'll make that the last species for this video. Really encourage you to be studying these outside, and that's part of the reason that I assigned the digital species collection, is to get you outside practicing these identifications, and then photographing and uploading your observations onto iNaturalist. I ended up having to drive around a bit to find a schooler's willow, so I don't think there's actually one at Tennant Lake. So if you go there looking for all 4 species, you might be disappointed, but there are 3 there, which is pretty good. I guess that's it. Thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you next time. For this week's lab, we're going to just focus on those 4 willows and review the features. I have them all in front of me now, so we could compare one to the next. And it's not going to be very involved, so I'm going to do this a little bit like a quiz show too. So I'll give you a chance to guess before I tell you what it is. So starting with this one, what are some features that you notice about the leaf? Upper surface, the lower surface, the margin, and the tip. Well, hopefully you've noticed that the tip is pointy, the margins are serrated, the leaf does not have hairs on the upper or lower surface. The stipules are pretty prominent. Oh, here's a feature that I didn't mention in the field. This is a bud. Now it'll get a little bit bigger than this as it develops throughout the summer, but the buds of this species look a little bit like a duckbill. So they have a ridge that runs down the center that's like the top of the duckbill, and then it flares out on either side, and it's kind of a little bit blunt on the tip, not super blunt, but a little bit blunt. So I mentioned in the field that the willow buds are just 2 scales that press together, and on this one the bottom scale is flat and the top scale is a little bit puckered up like this, which gives it that duckbill look. Okay, so this one here is the Pacific willow, Salix lasiandra. All right. Oh yeah, and it has that yellowish twig. Pacific willow. Now you may have noticed this structure here. That's a gall, so there's an insect living in there. There's also a gall on the leaf. The larval stage of some type of galling insect has burrowed into the leaf and released a hormone that has tricked the plant into growing this gall structure around the insect larva. And it actually feeds on the inside of that structure. Okay, so next let's look at this one here. So we could see that the upper surface of the leaf is fairly hairless. The twig is a very different color. It actually has a gall in it too. The leaves are not long acuminate at the tip, but they do have a little bit of a point. Then we get to that underside of the leaf. Got that two-tone quality to it. So what is it? This is the Salix sitchensis, the Sitka willow. So the dead giveaway for me is the underside of the leaf. And this will grow in wetlands, but also in upland sites. Okay, now we have, these are actually both the same plant. This is just new growth, first year twig, and this is older growth. And so what do we got? We have leaves that have some hairs on the bottom. The top, maybe we'll have some hairs in the spring, but right now it's hairless. It's pretty shiny and dark green on the top and just a dull green on the bottom. I guess that's true for all of them. If we cut this leaf in half, the broadest point is actually above the half line. True for this leaf too. Broadest point is towards the tip. And how about this first year growth? Is that still true? And the broadest point is kind of close to the middle there. Broadest point is above the middle. So this one, the habitat is really key. So it's growing usually in uplands more than in wetlands. And this is the Schooler's willow, Salix schooleriana. Okay. And the buds here, they're just rounded on one side and flat on the other. They don't have that ridge in the middle. So that makes it different from the Pacific willow. Okay, and the last one here, it has shiny green leaves that on the upper surface that can sometimes have hair, faint hair on the upper surface. And the undersurface is very densely hairy, so much so that it almost obscures the veins on the undersurface of the leaf. The young twigs are actually densely haired as well, gray-haired according to the book. And let's see, if we slice one of these leaves in half or find the midpoint, it's broadest at right about the midpoint. Here's another one, broadest right about the midpoint. So that seems to be true for most of these. But to be honest, I think looking at features, the features of the Schooler's willow is most similar to this one, but the habitat is very different. This one is always coastal and almost always in wetlands. Okay, so what's this one? This is the Hooker's willow or Salix hookeriana. Okay, so that concludes the short lab. No microscope work for this one. We'll just take some close-up photos of the different features for you to look at, and I'm actually splicing those into the video, so what I'm saying now is probably useless. But thanks all, and I'll see you next time.